What's up everyone, Darcblade here with another Hunter's Guide to Monster Hunter Rise Sunbreak. In this video we're going to be bringing you some full set budget builds, this time for the Darcblade. Now what is a full set budget build? Well, it's a easy to craft build made up of one entire armor set. Yes, it has a different weapon and different talismans, but it's aimed to reduce farming and enable you to have a build that is capable of getting through the main storyline of Monster Hunter Rise Sunbreak. Now as always, if you find these videos helpful or informative, please consider leaving a like on the video as well as maybe subscribing to the channel, as we bring you a variety of builds for a variety of ways to play. Now when it comes to the Darcblade, it has two distinct ways of playing. You have the more traditional super amped elemental discharge way of playing, or the condensed spinning slash, which I still refer to as the Savage Axe mode from Monster Hunter World Iceborne. Both of these playstyles both have their own unique advantages, and builds can be crafted and tailored to enhance whichever playstyle you prefer to use. The two builds that are going to be demonstrated in this video, the first one is more of a universal one which can use either of the playstyles, whilst the second build focuses more on the super amped elemental discharge spam, which to be honest is the easier way to play the Darcblade in my opinion. So the first build I'd refer to as the universal build, or for a more colourful name, the Death Stench build. This build, as I mentioned, allows players to make use of either the Savage Axe mode playstyle or the super amped elemental discharge playstyle, depending on how they prefer to play. It also has a fair amount of DPS skills, allowing you to take down monsters relatively quickly. So for this build you'll need the entire Death Stench set, which includes the Death Stench Brain X, Muscles X, Grips X, Bowels X and Heals X. As for your Petalace, this is down to personal preference. I go for the Absolute Petalace for some extra health when going through the game for the first time. And then for your talisman, well, no one's going to have the exact same talismans in all honesty. It's the major RNG element of Monster Hunter Rise and Sunbreak. But if you have a talisman that is able to get to weakness exploit at least level 2 and have a decoration slot or skill of critical boost at level 1, you'll be able to produce something similar to what's shown in this video. And then finally for the weapon, I'm using the Mighty Soul Crusher, which is the Magna Marlow Darcblade. Obviously, once you get to the point where you can fight Scorned Magna Marlow, this will be upgraded to that version of the weapon, but for the purpose of this video, I'm just showing the highest level of the normal Magna Marlow weapon we can get our hands on when we're going through the game for the first time. As for the Rampage skill, go for one of the anti-species decorations to give you something like Wyvern Exploit. So when it comes to the decorations, you've got a few to play around with, and some of these decorations are kind of essential. So I've gone for Critical Jaws to max out crit boost, Steadfast Jaws to max out stun resistance, Artillery Jaws to max out the artillery skill, Tenderizer Jaws to max out weakness exploit, and a Brace Jaw for a point in flinch free. So if you've done what I've done here, you'll have a build with 373 raw attack with 29 blast ailment. You'll also have purple sharpness with impact files, and you'll have 30% base affinity, which can be 80% when you take into account weakness exploit. You'll also have a decent defense of 711 that is strong against every element, especially fire, but is slightly weak to ice. As for the switch skills, these are down to personal preference. Like I said, this build works whether you prefer the condensed spinning slash or the super amped elemental discharge spam. So when it comes to the skills, first of all you'll have attack boost at level 4. Attack boost is a skill that increases the raw attack of a build, and at level 4 or above it provides us a percentage bonus to our raw attack. You'll have critical boost at level 3, increasing the damage of our attacks when they crit a monster, but this only applies to the raw portion of an attack, not the elemental portion, or in case of the Darcblade, the fire bursts that occur after certain attacks. You'll also have weakness exploit at level 3, increasing our affinity whenever we're attacking monster weak points, and this can be up to 50%. You'll then have maximum might at level 3. Maximum might is a skill that kicks in whenever we have full stamina. When that is the case, our base affinity is increased. You'll also have protective polish at level 3, which is a skill that allows us to put a protective coating over our sharpness gauge, preventing any sharpness loss for a small duration of time, allowing us to keep that purple sharpness for longer. You'll then have artillery at level 3, which increases the damage of our fire bursts with the Darcblade. Remember, the fire bursts cannot crit and will deal fixed damage to a monster regardless of what body part they hit. You'll then have stun resistance at level 3, negating all stun effects on our hunters. You'll then have speed sharpening at level 3, increasing how quickly we can sharpen our weapon and thus work in unison with protective polish in applying that protective coating over our sharpness gauge, preventing sharpness loss. You'll then have rapid morph at level 3, which is a byproduct of the armor, but it can still be useful for the Darcblade, especially if you are using the Savage Axe playstyle where you're transforming your sword and shield into the actual axe form of the Darcblade. You'll then have Slugger at level 1, this is a byproduct of the talisman, but increases the knockout potential of our attacks. You'll then have Fortify at level 1, which is a useful skill to go through the game, as whenever you cut and come back, you'll come back with increased attack and defense. And then finally you have Flinch Free at level 1, which is an optional skill from our decorations that prevents minor knockbacks from monsters and especially our allies. So there we have it, that is the universal build, or the Death Stench build that I like to use for the Charge Blade. But every build comes with pros and cons, no build is absolutely perfect. When it comes to the Death Stench budget build, its biggest pro is its versatility, able to make use of either the Savage Axe mode or the Super Amped Elemental Discharge spam. It can cater to either playstyle of the Charge Blade. On top of that, this build is actually quite effective when it comes to dealing damage. Thanks to having attack boost, crit boost, weakness exploit, maximum might and more, we're able to take down monsters relatively quickly with this build. And then finally is that this build can be used against pretty much any monster. Yes, okay, we have a weapon that focuses on the blast element, but to be honest it has such high raw attack, and rarely is a monster completely immune to the blast element, that this should work against anything we come across. But of course there are cons. One of the biggest cons is, unfortunately, there can be potential sharpness issues with this build, especially if you forget to apply that protective polish, as we only have a sliver of purple sharpness. And the other con is, unfortunately, the Death Stench armor is kind of difficult to get. Well, it's not really hard to farm, it's obtained through the Meowcenaries. If you're not aware, in order to get the Death Stench armor and craft it, you need the material known as Sinister Gloom Cloth, and this is obtained through the Meowcenaries. It says that you normally get this from sending your Meowcenaries off to sparkling bone piles at the various locations in the game, but I've only really found it in the Sandy Plains. So if you're looking to get this build, always make sure you're sending the Meowcenaries off. But once you've got the 5 Sinister Gloom Cloth, you'll have a very strong build for the Charge Blade that caters to either playstyle, and should see you through to the end of Monster Hunter Rise Sunbreak. But there is always more than one budget build out there, and if you prefer the Super Amped Elemental Discharge spam playstyle, then this next build is going to be right up your alley. So for this Super Amped Elemental Discharge build, or if you want a more colourful name, the Basil Juice or Basil Geese build, you'll need the following. First of all, you'll need the entire Basil Juice set, which includes the Basil Juice Helm X, Mail X, Braces X, Coil X and Greaves X. For my Petalace, this is down to personal preference, so Absolute Petalace for health. And then for your Talisman, now the Talisman here is kind of optional. All you need is to be able to have Weakness Exploit at least level 1 on it in some form. The rest is kind of optional. I've gone for Handicraft on my Talisman as well. And then finally for your weapon, you'll need the Sarah Sediment, which is the Diablos Charge Blade. And then when it comes to the Rampage skill, I either recommend taking Defense Edge or one of the anti-species decorations. Defense Edge will help us keep that purple sharpness for longer, especially given the playstyle of the Super Amped Elemental Discharge build, whilst the anti-species will increase our damage against certain monster types. So next up for the decorations, I've gone for the following. First of all, I've gone for Handicraft jewels to max out Handicraft. Handicraft, to be honest, in some respect is kind of optional. You can replace this with something else if you so wish. I've then gone for Steadfast jewels for stun resistance, critical jewels for crit boost, a Fortitude jewel for the Fortify skill, and then Tenderizer jewels to max out Weakness Exploit. So if you've done what I've done here, you'll have a build with a raw attack of 400 with no element, you'll also have purple sharpness with impact files, and you'll have negative 30% affinity, which can be 20% when you take into account Weakness Exploit. It could even be considered 35% when you take into account Agitator as well. But as this build is all about the Super Amped Elemental Discharge spam and getting the file bursts from our impact files going, we don't have to worry about affinity too much, as, like I said, the file bursts can't crit, but deal fixed damage regardless of what monster body part they hit. You'll then have a very strong defense of 771 that's strong against fire and water, but unfortunately weak to the other elements, especially thunder. When it comes to the switch skills though, because we're primarily using this build as a Super Amped Elemental Discharge machine, you want to consider skills like Counter Peak Performance to get your files back quickly. The rest of the switch skills are kind of down to personal preference. So when it comes to the skills, first of all you'll have Agitator at level 5. Agitator is a skill that kicks in whenever a monster becomes enraged. When this happens, we'll gain increased raw attack and 15% base affinity. You'll then have Handicraft at level 5, increasing the sharpness gauge of our weapon, allowing us to get to purple sharpness. You'll then have Guard at level 5, which increases how effectively we can guard against monster attacks, which is great for our defense. and performing guard reactions. Basically increasing the guard skill reduces the knockback from monster attacks, which allows us to perform more guard reactions after we block an attack, as well as reduce the stamina cost for blocking those said attacks. You'll then have weakness exploit at level 3, which increases our affinity whenever we're attacking monster weak points, but this is kind of optional in all honesty. But to be honest, when performing the super amped elemental discharge as well as our sword attacks when we're charging up the weapon, it's still nice to have some positive affinity when we're attacking monster weak points. You'll then have Razor Sharp at level 3, which gives us a chance of our weapon not losing sharpness. You'll then have Guard Up at level 1, which allows us to block unblockable attacks and reduce the damage taken from those unblockable attacks. You'll then have Artillery at level 3, which is one of the main skills for this build that increases the file damage of our attacks. You'll then have Load Shells at level 2, which is a skill that increases the charge blade file capacity, and basically what this means is we only have to charge the files to yellow to fully stock all the files available to us. You'll then have Stun Resistance at level 2. It would have been nice to get this higher, but Stun Resistance at level 2 is still helpful as it reduces the stun effect on our hunter by 90%. You'll then have Critical Boost at level 1, which, to be honest, is again optional, but the physical attacks from our super amped elemental discharge as well as sword attacks, if they do crit, it is nice to have some additional damage that Critical Boost at level 1 provides. And then finally you'll have Fortify at level 1, which is a skill that kicks in whenever you faint and cart, as you'll come back with increased raw attack and defense, and this can be applied twice during any one hunt. So it's a nice skill for going through the game. So there we have it, that is the super amped elemental discharge spam build. In a way it is a very defensive build, but it still has the capacity to dish out damage when you're performing the super amped elemental discharge over and over again. But of course it does have its pros and cons. One of the biggest pros for this build is its survivability. Having skills like guard up, as well as the high defense it has, means that it gives you a high chance at surviving hits from the tougher monsters in the game. On top of that, this build has decent damage output, thanks to Agitator, Weakness Exploit, Artillery, and even the point in Critical Boost. It means that we should be able to take this build against monsters and bring them down quite quickly, so long as you're utilising the correct playstyle. And then finally is that this build can be used against pretty much any monster, not only thanks to the weapon being an elementalist weapon, but because we are focusing primarily on our file bursts, thanks to the super amped elemental discharge. It means that we can dish out fixed damage to a monster regardless of what monster body part we hit, or regardless of what elemental or element resistance they have. Because of this fixed damage, it means that this build can be effectively used against any monster we come across. But of course there are cons. One of the biggest cons is, unfortunately, to get purple sharpness we have to invest in handicraft, and we can burn through that quite quickly. And the other con is, unfortunately, this build is a little bit suffering when it comes to its affinity rating. It would be better to have positive affinity on the weapon, but the trade-off is the high raw attack, which also translates and transfers to the damage our file bursts will deal. But I would strongly recommend this build for anyone who's going through the game, who wants a little bit more of a comfortable build for the charge blade, and who prefers the super amped elemental discharge spam. A reminder for those of you who don't know, the effective way to play this build is to either perform your sword attacks to charge your files, or the counter peak performance to instantly get your files stored. Then afterwards, every single time your files are ready, either through your sword attacks or counter peak performance, you just perform the super amped elemental discharge, rinse and repeat. And for me, this was the build that I used to defeat the final boss of Sunbreak for the first time. So I hope it helps you too in your hunts. And until next time, I've been Darcblade, bringing you more full set budget builds, this time for the Charge Blade in Monster Hunter Rise Sunbreak. Hope you enjoyed the video, thanks for watching, subscribe and like for more.